Hello, and thanks for joining us. My name is Ronen Vengosh, and I'm VP of Platform and Ecosystem for Egnyte. And with me today is Nolan McDonnell of Science Exchange. Hi, Nolan. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So in this podcast, we talk about the ways in which folks like ourselves build and maintain ecosystems and grow products. And, for those that are not familiar with Science Exchange, would you mind kind of walking us through some high-level overview of the company, what you guys do, and how you go about doing it?
Sure. So at Science Exchange, our mission is to improve the quality and efficiency of scientific research. And the way we do so is by providing a platform for the effective management of outsourced research and development. So at our core, we are a marketplace in which we've pre-contracted and pre-qualified more than 3,000 scientific service providers. So CROs, CMOs, academic facilities. And we work with enterprise R&D organizations like big pharma, biotech, and provide them an end-to-end solution. So they have access to that network to be able to discover, order, manage, and pay for scientific services.
So one of the things that we spoke about when we were preparing for this recording is that your role in the company is VP of Products, and yet you have ownership of the partnership side of the house. Can you talk a little bit about your role and how you see those two kind of elements of product and alliances coming together?
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm VP of Product, which I'm responsible for the product development functions at Science Exchange. So that includes product, engineering, design, and data. And I think what I've seen is that the role of product and partnerships and alliances are becoming increasingly intertwined. And I think that's particularly true for B2B technologies in itself.
How so? Like, why are they becoming intertwined, do you think?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I look at it from a product angle of trying to focus on solving our customers' problems. And I think when we look at those problems and the technologies that are built to solve them, those technologies are becoming increasingly more specialized and niche. And organizations, therefore, are more open to adopting a best-of-breed technology when it comes to engaging with their technology partners. However, they still have then that expectation that all those different tools will work together seamlessly and they won't have to duplicate workflow steps.
It's almost as if the kind of the outer boundaries of the product are becoming fuzzier, right? It's like customers want to accomplish a certain workflow or a certain task or a certain use case, but they don't particularly care whether it's in your product or in my product. They just want to make sure that the entire thing goes off without a hitch, and that they invest as little time and effort as possible in getting that to actually do the right thing.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I think it's becoming where those walls are increasingly fuzzy. And from a product perspective, it becomes interesting because standalone, you can't block the end-to-end workflow. But then when you're part of a bigger picture, you can also add complexities. So that's why I think that product partnership perspective becomes increasingly more relevant as you aim to solve those problems.
I totally agree. The interesting thing about kind of the alliances function is that it touches so many different things. And, it brings to mind in a previous episode of this podcast, I was speaking with Derek Novak of DocuSign, and his responsibility comes more from the business side of the house or the channel side of the house, and his perspective on adopting partnerships or growing partnerships is that, the primary driver is kind of sales. And I can totally see the value of that point. Your company, on the other hand, is looking at it from a completely different perspective, looking at the alliances function as something that enhances the user experience and therefore the product. Two completely different points of view, both valid in different settings. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't know if they're completely different. It's definitely a different angle to approach it, and definitely a little biased in terms of, again, like thinking of it from the product perspective. And I like to think by solving those problems, increasing usability, there's a downstream benefit of increase in sales. But I also like the way we approach partnerships. You're exactly right. Is we actually take it from the lens of, okay, we need to understand what problem this partnership can potentially solve for our customers, but also for both partners involved, right? And what are the possible benefits that we see out of this? Is it going to just drive more leads, like a channel partnership type deal? Are there operational benefits, combination of these, et cetera? But I also think we take it pretty important to align that to our current roadmap and the problems we're trying to solve to keep the overall organization moving together and focused. But I also think it's really important that you go through the steps of assessing the partner's technology if there's going to be a technical component, and really understanding what's the end-to-end journey, how is it going to work, what is the level of effort, and the implementation plan. And where I see a lot of crossover with the channels is we actually try to define a partnership MVP and understand that, maybe from the partnership MVP, we don't take a technical approach and it is focused on a channel perspective.
Let's talk about this notion of a partnership MVP, because I think the concept is definitely a familiar one, but I think with your product hat on, it comes very naturally to you. And one of the things that I kind of experience pretty frequently, both from our own sales team, both from prospective partners, is this notion of when you're jumping into a new relationship or a new partnership, that the, I guess, resulting product or integration needs to absolutely solve every use case and so forth. And one of the challenges with that, of course, is with that perfection comes a much higher cost and so forth. How do you think about this partnership MVP? How do you define it? And what are the implications of kind of adopting that mindset?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting approach, and we definitely face that challenge that you articulated of the pressure to solve every which problem. So it's definitely it takes a lot of champion from that perspective. But yeah, when I think about an MVP from a partnership, it does depend on what that partnership is and the objective it seeks to obtain. So, for example, a partnership that you could foresee in the future being able to accelerate payments, for example, like partnering with a type of a payment solution, maybe actually the best way to test if those synergies are really there from a partnership perspective is actually to just do a referral partnership to start from. And why that may be beneficial is actually understand then how the market is going to react to that combination, that message that you're putting out there. And then if you see traction from that front, you then may want to move into more of a tightly integrated partnership perspective. But I also think, being a spirit of a technology organization, and a lot of our partnerships do lead to that conversation of what we do from a technical front. It's that same conversation of understanding what is the minimum work we have to do to add value and really test to see this work, if this works. A lot of things work on paper, right? But when you understand that, hey, actually, even though this seems to make sense, but your user base is actually quite different than ours, it's easier to catch those hiccups or challenges by lower investing. So, for example, it could be instead of doing a API integration, let's just do an iframe to start out, for example, and measure what type of return we get there.
I think the concept of kind of this partnership MVP really talks to being more modest in our evaluation of our own understanding of the market, right? One of the things that I very frequently find about myself is what I think is a brilliant idea falls flat on its face when it actually, gets put into practice, and vice versa. Something that I think makes, very little creates very little new value, all of a sudden, catches fire and becomes this exciting thing that everybody's talking about.
Sure.
And, I personally haven't cracked the code on, when I'm wrong and when I'm right. And so the approach of minimizing your upfront costs, I think, doesn't only make sense from a cost perspective, but also from a product success perspective.
Sure. No, I totally agree. I think it's an interesting point because sometimes you do get into a chicken and egg situation. So that's why it kind of could become a challenge to try to stay disciplined to the MVP approach. So what I mean by that is, we did this MVP and that's why we're not seeing the value. But if we took these next 10 steps, we would see the value. But we also don't want to invest because we can't prove that those 10 steps happen. So it kind of becomes this trying to understand what approach to take.
Right. And really the question becomes, what is minimally viable, and how do you know if by now you should have hit that minimal viability? That's not something I think will ever be, completely, I guess, solved or addressed. I did want to switch subjects for a little bit and specifically talk about the life sciences industry. One of the things that I find very exciting and appealing about my job is the fact that I get to work with folks in different industries, and every industry, every new market segment has its own nuances and ways to do things that is somewhat different from others. And when you look at the life sciences space, this is an industry that's always been kind of data intensive. But in recent years, it has gone through an incredible transformation, automation, and inflation in the number or the amount, sheer amount of data that's being generated. But not only that, there's been a shift from kind of this traditional centralized model of research and development and production to now kind of a distributed marketplace where there's a lot of specialization, a lot of different entities provide services to others. And with that comes, I guess, a great challenge in terms of getting all of that stuff to work, all these industries and partnerships. And I know you guys at Science Exchange are at the very center of this transformation and the challenges. What is your take on that? Where is it going? What are some of the big challenges that need to be addressed?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think all the points that you raised are definitely valid, but I also think all those points actually build off of each other. You know, moving to more outsourced networked R&D produces more data outside your walls, which increases the data produced. So I think it is an interesting transformation. I think the way I look at it, and maybe it's useful to take a step back and kind of understand what's driving some of these trends. So in the life science industry, there is a major productivity issue, and organizations are really looking at ways to increase their internal rate of return. And in doing so, one of the methodologies that they've taken up is, leaner development practice and virtual development practices. So leveraging an outsourced network. And it's been shown that in 2020, over 50% of R&D spend is going to actually be on outsourced partners. So I think some of the drivers are that is again, they just want to lower those costs and maximize that productivity, but also due to the emergence of more complex and specialized technologies in R&D areas, it becomes increasingly challenging to keep up with those innovations and be able to tap into them. So I think when you talk about the role of partnerships and collaboration and where it's going, is it's becoming imperative that if you want to be able to innovate and move at that's effective and at effective speed, you need to leverage an outsourced network. And I think that's from, more of the scientific partners perspective, but also then again, it kind of feeds off each other. To do that successfully, there's a lot of value in then leveraging technology partners to support those activities.
Right. And we haven't even begun to talk about kind of, the issues of security and compliance, that are very big deals for this industry. How does one take that into consideration, in this, I guess, partnership strategy? What are some of the big things that folks need to pay attention to?
Yeah, I think when you talk about the regulatory components and security components, and what's interesting is that from a regulatory perspective, sponsor organizations are still essentially responsible for the interactions and actions of their third-party vendors. So for example, the HIPAA omnibus rule requires that from a data security perspective, sponsor organizations are responsible for their third parties. So I think what that means is you need to treat your partner network as essentially an extension of yourself. And I think that's from a lens of, a buying organization. But then I think as a technology company, to be able to succeed in this evolving ecosystem, it is therefore our responsibility to provide a reliable and effective way for them to accomplish that goal.
Yeah, and at Egnyte, when we're talking about life sciences kind of efforts, whether it's with partnerships or directly with our customers, it's security and compliance are kind of at the center of the equation. It's yes, ease of use is critical, and we focus on that, but kind of table stakes are compliance and security there, and it's really something that you have to kind of take into consideration, even when you're doing these partnerships, technology or otherwise. So we've covered that. And I'd like to switch gears on you a little bit. I'm going to turn you into the spokesperson for younger companies out there. One of the things that I think is very clear fact of our industry is that there are some very big cloud providers out there. And I'm talking, of course, about Google and AWS and Microsoft, who are kind of dominating the landscape for infrastructure. And a lot of us smaller players, some smaller than others, but a lot of us smaller players need to engage and kind of work with these folks. What are some of the things that you wish larger organizations would take into consideration when working with smaller, younger companies?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot, but I think a couple that really are top of mind when it comes to working between larger, younger organizations and being the spokesperson for younger organizations is I think it's important that larger organizations really recognize the importance of speed for younger and smaller companies. When younger and smaller organizations make a decision to move forward with a partner, that's a significant percentage of resource, time, and focus that's pointed in that direction. And I think there's a major opportunity cost when large organizations kind of drag their feet and don't move as quickly. And that opportunity cost is definitely a lot more hurtful for organizations that are smaller than the large organization.
In your estimation, is this something that is a reasonable ask? I mean, can these larger organizations move faster, or is it by virtue of them being these large ships, they take time to turn? Are you really asking for more speed or more clarity? Is this something that smaller companies, as they're deciding to engage, with the bigger organizations, they should come, wearing the patience hat? They know that it's going to take time. They know that it's going to take longer than they expect. What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's definitely a fair perspective and say, this is the way larger organizations work. It's driving a cruise ship, not a speedboat or jet ski or what have you. And I think that's fair, but I also think that's not necessarily has to be the truth. I think if anything, large organizations should be trying to adopt some of that nimbleness that smaller organizations offer. And you see large organizations try to formulate groups and teams that are focused on that partnership component and strategy. And I think as part of that, how they measure success should be able to move in that way. But I also think transparency to that whole process is really important. I think if you're very upfront and transparent for what to expect out of the partnership, it could help mitigate how smaller organizations plan, for example. But I do think, though, you just mentioned too, is seeing it from the patient's perspective. I think it'd be interesting if we kind of change the narrative to, and as we've talked about before, is large organizations actually seeing the smaller organizations as a customer and the value of engaging with them. And the reality is that if, treating the customer poorly or slowly has negative impacts for us.
So over my career, I've kind of learned to deal with engagements with these large organizations as strategic bets. And I take into consideration the fact that, my thesis, even if it's true, is going to take, a fair amount of time to mature and kind of prove itself out. And I come into it setting those expectations internally with my own team, with my own leadership, to make sure that everybody knows, hey, here's why we're doing this. This is what we expect in the long term. And here's how we know if we're on the right track. But it's going to take some time, and we're going to have to be patient in order to get there. One of the things that I want to ask you, because I know everybody in our line of work has these tips and tricks. How do you engage with organizations that are larger, significantly larger than yourselves? What are some of the tools that you have in your toolkit to kind of attract their attention and retain it?
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely a challenge, right, for a small organization that, some organizations may not even heard of. I do still think the key is finding that right person that will champion you at that organization. You can kind of make noise by, in a positive way by talking to multiple individuals, but I think it does come down to really that quality and the right person to champion you. I also think from that perspective, it's again kind of a large organization, a little bit more robust in planning and where that cruise ship's headed. It's important to kind of have the problem and the mutual benefits really in that business plan and the really ironed out. And I think that helps a lot too. So that business case, presenting that in a clear manner to the right person, is a way you kind of sell them and get them to drive it and champion it internally.
What's the makings of a successful pitch there, or the right business case? What does that mean to them?
Yeah, I think certain organizations are focused on different things, kind of when we talked about the essence of the partnerships in general. But I think it's about showing those benefits across those multitude of possibilities. So this is going to lead to possible growth, new customer acquisition. It's going to be a brand play for you by showing your commitment to innovation. All those are different levers that you can pull as part of this overarching picture that you paint for them.
Do you think that these are, I guess, concrete enough for most folks that you talk to, or does that mean that you have to really find kind of an individual with that kind of mindset?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a balance. I've been pleasantly surprised, I think, by the reaction that we get from leaders in these organizations. I think we're lucky in the sense that the industry and market are so clearly going towards this outsourced world in which science change is fit for purpose. So I think we have that benefit of really, they already understand what the reality is and they feel the pain, and we're kind of uniquely positioned to support that.
One of my personal tools that I use for stuff like that is I always ask people, sometimes quite bluntly, I ask them, okay, how do you get bonused? How do you get compensated? What are the metrics that you're trying to move so that I know if I can impact what it is that you're trying to do? I find that it's people are incredibly open to answer that question when it's asked in a direct way, because really, what I'm trying to do is align goals and incentives, and that's the way it's received. We've covered that. How do you choose who to partner with? How do you go and start building an ecosystem as a smaller organization? What are the key criteria? What do you look for in a partner?
Yeah, it's an interesting and maybe surprisingly complex question from my perspective. And I think, one of the challenges of a smaller organization going about building out this ecosystem partnership, probably one of the top three, I would say, is prioritization. I think it's really important to hone in on how you're prioritizing who to partner with. And that can become increasingly challenging, especially for a platform for us being a marketplace in the center of our own ecosystem. There's a lot of possible partner plays, and we get solicited from partners. We have our targets ourselves, and it can be really difficult to hone in on what you want to do. And that's a kind of touched on it earlier. I think it's important to be disciplined to really assessing what the benefits we're trying to achieve out of that for both partners, but also what we're going to ultimately provide to the customer. But I also think timing is important. So understanding the relevance to what we're trying to solve right now and how it accentuates it. So for that sense, we may be hearing a lot of customer feedback, a lot of pain points, and that we want to move forward. Maybe a useful way to kind of add some more color would be to talk about, from an example standpoint, Egnyte, right? So we were increasingly engaged with biotech organizations on our platform, and we are increasingly also seeing this challenge that our customers were facing with managing the results obtained by working with their outsourced partners. So as we talked about before, working with a scientific service provider outside your walls, they're generating a lot of data, and these organizations need to be able to receive that data and understand and manipulate it. We looked at kind of some of the current state and the challenges of onboarding suppliers and getting them to internal tools, all the manual downloading, uploading. It was just creating a lot of friction and a very key workflow step for us. So when we kind of looked at the market and really understood what they were using from a file transfer and security standpoint, Egnyte was a very prominent player amongst our shared customer base. So that's why we decided and thought it makes sense to prioritize and work with Egnyte to develop a solution that we're able to automatically transfer the data from the CROs to the Egnyte folders for our customers.
What I'm hearing is finding the problem and then following that problem through your customers and kind of settling on partners, prospective partners that way. one of the things that we've tried to do when we first started to engage in kind of the life sciences industry is we came at this with a great deal of modesty because, as I said, every industry has its own little quirks. And the way we approached it is we started by kind of talking to a large number of customers and gradually honed in on a number of kind of highly thoughtful, advanced customers that had a whole vision for what they would like their kind of process to be. And then we said, okay, let's build the process to that vision. Mm-hmm. Of course, after making sure that others shared the same problems. And that's how we kind of started to identify the key partners that we wanted to engage and coordinate with. And that's been extraordinarily successful. So I think we covered a lot of ground today. And as part of my questions, one of the things that, or as we were preparing for this recording today, one of the things that struck me is that you and I are in a fairly privileged position in our roles, since both you and me have our own engineering teams that we can set priorities for, right? Mm-hmm. So after we make this, decision of where we need to partner, we can actually define roadmap items and then have them happen without having to kind of beg, borrow, and steal resources from other people's roadmaps. How did you, land in this fortunate position? It's fairly unusual in our space, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm questioning if, my business partner set you up to this, but because, I think it's definitely an interesting point. You kind of do have the keys to the castle in some degree. Yeah, I think the way that I ended up in this role was just coming from a management consulting background, really focused on technology enablement for biotech life science organizations. So I gravitated towards product, but also just reaping the benefits of being a small organization, being able to be leveraged for these partnership discussions and decisions are pretty key. And so from that sense, kind of was a natural fit. And again, I think we have kind of really clearly defined what that vision looks like and the importance of alliances to really seeing that vision through. And we've been able to really get support of the business behind that, and they do understand the value. So I think we do all work pretty well to still move towards that unified direction.
I think this is a structure many organizations should kind of think about, because what it allows us to do is move very quickly. When we spot an opportunity, kind of grow the business from a partnership perspective, we can just execute on that. Now, unlike your role, which covers the full, portfolio of product, my engineering team, my development team only works on kind of these partnerships, which allows us to really kind of focus on growing kind of the ecosystem without being dependent on kind of somebody else's roadmap. One of the last questions I have for you on that front is this issue of measurement, right? So how do you know if a partnership is successful? What makes a successful partner, and how do you know when you've got one?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the way we go about it is making sure that, first off, defining what that success is up front. So what success metrics are we looking for to get out of this partnership? And first off, define what those measurements are. And then 2, do we have the means to measure them? And 3, can we provide access to those measurements to be able to continuously monitor them over time? And I think that has led to being disciplined that has been successful. And we do manage those measurements, proactively in real time. And I think what's important about that is to have that conversation with your partner together, define what those metrics that you're trying to achieve in unison. And then our major partnerships, we do have governance committees around that. And we do meet on a regular cadence, and we always review those same metrics for success and understand the activities that have led to them to improve, or what we're seeing if we think they're not improving, and have the discussion based off that.
Is there a single metric or one metric that stands out as the most predictive for a successful partnership?
I don't know if there's one metric, for example. I think an easy one to gravitate to would be the increase in, lead generation that eventually leads to like requests in our language. So it leads to growth. I think most partnerships are probably traditionally, it's easier to see from that lens. But I think, again, kind of, what we've been talking about this whole conversation is that there's a lot more intertwined handshakes between partners now that you can get into a lot more interesting metrics.
We're coming up on the end of our podcast today, and I always like to end these conversations with a question about one deal that you've had throughout your career that you're kind of proudest of and that you thought made a big difference to the organization you were at. It doesn't have to be anything recent, doesn't have to be anything from Science Exchange, just in general. Is there a deal like that you can share?
Yeah, I think the one that comes top of mind would probably be our partnership with Jagger. To provide a little context, so Science Exchange does provide punch-out integrations to procurement systems. So if you're a scientist at a pharma organization, you have Jagger, you'd go out to the punch-out catalog and punch out to Science Exchange. And we were essentially having to set these integrations up at every single customer that we were onboarding. And you can imagine the challenges with that, especially being a small organization, is we have to then leverage our technical resources, but also get alignment with these organizations' IT resources, which can be extremely challenging and be kind of disruptive to how you're trying to plan your development. So essentially what we did was we engaged with Jagger and we created an out-of-the-box or turnkey integration with them that would essentially allow us to roll out punch-out integrations to customers with no involvement from our technical resources, from customers or from us. And I guess the reason why I really like this one is kind of a multitude of, one, the channel opportunities. So being able to tap into a large organization's reach, shortening our implementation and onboarding timelines of our customers. So obviously we sign a contract, we want to get them leveraging our platform as soon as possible, but also value from our customers, from them not having to invest into have the integration set up, them not having to have that prioritization of their IT resource conversation, which made it a lot easier. But I also think that selfishly from a product perspective, owning the roadmap, it then got technical resource time back so we could actually focus on some more meaningful features. But probably my favorite thing about this example is it really demonstrated and validated the value of an alliance approach to solving issues like this. By taking the time to invest a bit more upfront and working directly with the technology partner themselves, we're essentially able to formulate a much mutually beneficial and much more scalable solution.
So you got kind of a three for here. The customer's happier, you have faster time to revenue with each customer, and you got back some of your engineering time. So it's all around, everybody's a winner.
That's exactly right.
On that note, Nolan, thank you very much for joining us today. This was an extremely fun conversation. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on.
Nolan McDonnell, everybody, with VP of Product at Science Exchange. And I'm Ronen Vengosh with Egnyte. Thank you for joining us.